There was one friend that is the single dumbest character in a movie I think I've ever seen in my entire life. And I've seen Little Nicky. So that is saying a lot.
Welcome to episode 230 of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast. We're a weekly nerd culture podcast that discusses nerddom through various segments. You can find us at thenerdspodcast.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter through our handle at The Nerds Podcast. If you'd like to reach us directly, including sending us suggestions for our nerd favorite segment, you can email us at thenerdsyou'relooking4@gmail.com. Additionally, we have a YouTube page under the Nerds You're Looking For banner, and each of us has a Letterboxd account, which is basically social media for watching movies. I'm at that Tyler Hunt, and my co-host Pat can be found at the Nerds Podcast on Letterboxd. With all of that being said, and without further ado, alongside me, as always, is my co-host Pat Attack. How's it going, dude?
I'm good. How are you?
I am fine, I suppose.
It's like you don't know I'm going to ask you that question.
Yeah, I figure anytime I say, how's it going, man, you go into some story about your week or about how you're tired or something, and I wasn't expecting you to ask me back how I was doing, so I appreciate that.
That is a theme of like some of my past relationships and friends. I literally have a problem where, and I guess you could just say it's because I'm a very selfish person, which I am. I've had friends bust my balls. Well, they'll ask me a question, and then like I'll answer it, and then like 30 seconds later they'll be like, "Now you ask me." Like that's how conversations work. So yeah, it is a bit surprising that I would ask you, but I guess I'm trying to be a better friend and actually care about what you say.
That's very nice of you. One of the best pieces of advice I was ever given was that people love to talk about themselves. So anytime I'm in an awkward conversation, not that we have awkward conversations, I just resort to basically asking questions because people will typically take the ball from there.
Oh, yeah. And if you've learned one thing in 230 episodes of this podcast is that I love talking about myself.
You do, yeah. I mean, the podcast has grown into a YouTube channel and the videos on Facebook and Twitter and all of the other things we do via social media. And it's probably no surprise, and we've said it a few times, that Pat is pretty much the content creator behind all that, because heaven forbid he go a Sunday to a Sunday without talking about something nerdy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And one thing I did want to mention, you talked about my Facebook reviews. You'll be happy to know that I, of course, as part of our Rotten Tomatoes film draft bet I lost last year. So you're making me watch a movie a month that obviously I wouldn't watch normally. And this month, March, was Medea Family Funeral. And you will be happy to know that that movie was just as bad as I thought it was going to be. The theater going experience wasn't as bad as What Men Want, which was February's movie. I had to think of the month. I'm an idiot, but it wasn't quite as bad as that theater experience, but the movie was so much worse. I thought there's no way after seeing Serenity that had to be my worst movie of the year, because it was just so boring and stupid. Medea, hands down. I think I've only ever given another movie on the podcast a half star. I gave Medea a half star.
Good. I'm glad that I'm 3 for 3 at this point, to be honest. And like looking at the movies I have scheduled so far, like I've said it before, Breakthrough is my masterpiece. I absolutely cannot wait for you to have to go see Breakthrough. But Medea was a close second. It's just not a movie that you would ever watch. And I think you made the comment whenever we did that episode that you hadn't seen any of the other Medea movies, so you were afraid you were going to be lost. So I'm glad that it was everything that I hoped it would be.
It was so weird to me because it was written like a soap opera, but it was actually kind of shot like a soap opera, just like the lighting and the way they cut and just some of the scenes, how they were framed. It felt 100% like a soap opera. And some of the characters were really stupid. Like Medea was fine. Like I knew that going in that was going to be ridiculous. But what I didn't understand is that she has like friends that like hang around her, and there was one friend that is the single dumbest character in a movie I think I've ever seen in my entire life. And I've seen Little Nicky. So that is saying a lot.
So here's a fact about me that I'm not super proud of, but I think I've said it on the podcast before. My wife does not have good taste in movies or men, but mostly.
I'm glad that you said it.
But mostly movies. And, whenever you start dating someone, you want to try to impress them and do things that they like. So I did watch a Medea movie at one point when Brittany and I started dating. And I think I fell asleep during it because, as you can imagine, like Medea Family Funeral, it was awful. And the thing that caught me off guard about whichever one it was that we watched was it was very dramatic. And it dealt with like this girl getting beat and abused, and Medea was like the comic relief, but it was not a funny, like it wouldn't have been a funny movie had it just been a Medea movie, but it was way more serious than I ever expected it to be. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. And it's weird. We're analyzing this movie much more than it deserves. And I think I actually said that during my review, was that I'm thinking analytically about this movie that doesn't deserve it. But it feels weird. Like it's super uneven. Like you said, like you have this character that's clearly supposed to be comic relief, and there's these super heavy situations. Like in the movie, the patriarch of the family has a heart attack and dies, and they're in the hospital, and Medea's like cracking jokes and shit. And I'm just like, this is like the worst day of some of these people's lives, because I've lived through that exact situation, and they're fucking cracking jokes, and it feels super weird that we're supposed to laugh during this.
Yeah, that's rough, man. Just so out of curiosity, and we can throw a spoiler alert up if anybody is actually interested in this movie, but does she die?
No, she doesn't die.
Ah, bummer. I really thought that they say it a Medea family funeral, but I was really hoping the funeral would be for that character, because I know Tyler Perry has said that he's done, but let's face it, he's not done. So
no, the patriarch of the family. I guess this is a little bit of a spoiler, but he literally. It just shows you how fucking ridiculous this movie is. He literally has a heart attack while he's having S&M sex with a family friend, not his wife, on him and his wife's anniversary. Like they're literally having a party for their anniversary, and he gets caught in a hotel, and he has a heart attack and dies.
Hilarious.
Yeah, that's how just ridiculous and melodramatic this movie was. It was so stupid.
Yeah, man, we've probably spent a little bit too much time on Medea, but
for sure.
I am glad that the punishment is working out.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, and then we can move on after I make this point. But
sure.
Like you've been talking about Breakthrough as being your masterpiece as far as this bet's concerned, but I don't know, man. Like I feel like I'm invincible at this point. I sat through a 2-hour Medea movie. Like I feel like nothing can hurt me now.
That's fair. I in all honesty, I'm a little worried about the second half of the year because there's been so much quality stuff that you've had to sit through at the beginning. I feel like it's all downhill from here.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I feel like I can pretty much watch anything. I really, really wanted to walk out. Like there's a couple of moments where I was just like, I just can't imagine a producer or anybody higher up than Tyler Perry seeing this and being like, yeah, we're definitely going to put this out. Like this is worth putting out in theaters.
It doesn't matter, man. It's going to make money because dumb people like dumb movies, and that's at the end of the day what they care about is the check they get a cash.
For sure. But it was so disappointing.
For sure.
All right. So we break these episodes just up into segments, and the first segment that we do is just kind of checking in with each other. We call it What We're Into. So what are you into this week?
So I went to see a movie this weekend as well, but it was not Medea. It was Greta. So I had seen the trailer for this movie, but had forgot that it was coming out this past weekend. It stars Chloe Grace Moretz as a character named Frances and Isabel Huppert as the character Greta. So if you haven't seen the trailer, the IMDb trivia or synopsis for this movie says that it's about a young woman befriending a lonely widow who's harboring a dark and deadly agenda towards her. So I didn't have a ton of expectations for this movie going into it, but I was pretty intrigued by the trailer for it, and my curiosity was definitely piqued. So with that being said, I would say that I walked away from this movie liking it quite a bit. It's definitely not perfect by any stretch. Yeah, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought that it was a pretty fun thriller. Story-wise, everything is pretty solid, except for a few beats towards the end of the movie that I won't spoil, but didn't make a lot of sense. So one thing I appreciated about the story was how quickly this movie gets to the point. I think a lot of times when you go to a movie like this and you see in the trailer that obviously a character like Greta is the antagonist and she's going to stalk and make Frances's life a living hell, that it's going to take a while for that to start happening. But this movie does not play the slow burn. And we find out the cruel intentions that Greta has pretty early in the movie. I think a lot of movies go the opposite way and they do the slow burn, and you don't find out until halfway through the movie that a character is bad when you go into the movie knowing that that's what it's leading to. So, like I said, I think it's a really good thing that Frances finds out pretty quick that Greta is a psychopath, and the rest of the movie is basically her dealing with it, and essentially she's being stalked by this crazy old woman. So, like I said, the story progresses and things heat up, and the thriller aspect of this movie definitely kicks in, and it's mostly good stuff in my opinion, but there is a character choice that I referenced that sets up the climax of the movie that is really dumb and doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think if you take that out, you have a much more solid film, but it definitely doesn't hamper the other things that this movie does, in my opinion. So performance-wise, Chloe Grace Moretz is mostly good. If I'm being honest, as much as I love her as an actress and feel like I've watched her grow up since Kick-Ass, I'm not sure she has a ton of range, which is evident here. But I'll still unapologetically love most of what she does, just because, again, we've watched her since she was like 10 years old when she was first in Kick-Ass. And then I think Isabel Huppert is great as well. I'm not really familiar with her work, but the creepy nuances of her performance are really good, and the scenes where she gets really crazy aren't forced and feel legitimately insane to me. So I have a feeling that you're going to chime in with your thoughts, Pat, but overall, I'd recommend this movie. I'm not sure what the rewatchability of a movie like this will be once you know how it plays out, but right now I'd probably give it a solid 3.5 out of 5.
That's super surprising to me because my wife and I went and watched this as well, and I kind of stole your idea a little bit. I don't know if we've talked about this already on the podcast or not, but I have been keeping track on Letterboxd. I have a list where I rank every 2019 movie that I'm seeing, and so I think I have like 14 or 15 movies already on that list because, as we've discussed before, I've been seeing a lot of movies in theaters. I'm on pace for like over 100. I doubt that will continue once football season starts back up again.
Sure.
But I will definitely hit my 60 pretty easily. I might hit my 60 by like June. It's at the current pace. I'm watching a lot of movies, but I think that it just tells you how bad of a year it's been so far that Greta is my 10th favorite movie this year because I hated this movie. I thought it was really just not interesting at all. I feel like, you know how movies have like the subtitles, not necessarily a subtitle, but like it has the colon and then it has a longer title. I feel like this should be Greta, How Not to Deal with a Stalker. That's how I felt the entire movie while I was watching this movie. Like every choice that she makes as far as dealing with Greta, I would do the complete opposite thing. Change your phone number, move away for a little bit. Like that was the plan. But then she goes and talks to Greta. And I'm just like, why the fuck would you do that? That makes no sense given what just happened in the movie. So I feel like every choice that she made in this movie, I would make the opposite choice. And it was really frustrating and annoying to watch a character make the wrong choice every fucking step of the way. And I always think that having dream sequences in the middle of a movie is a terrible story device, because I didn't trust anything else I saw the rest of the movie. And maybe that was a choice that they made on purpose, but there's a scene right after the dream sequence where she kind of fucks up Greta a little bit, and I'm like, okay, I'm waiting for the dream sequence, like I'm waiting for that to kick in, and it never kicked in. But the entire time I was watching that scene, I was like, okay, I'm waiting for that to happen. Like, I didn't believe it. And I think having a dream sequence in a movie like this kind of deflates a lot of the stuff that happens after it, because in the back of my head, I'm like, oh, well, they're probably just doing another dream sequence. So there's a lot of things in this movie that I just didn't particularly like. Again, every choice that she made seemed ridiculous and not the choice that I would make. And then I thought that the turn that this movie takes, I saw pretty early on in the movie. Now, of course, you know Greta just by the trailer that she's a terrible person and that she's a stalker and all that good stuff. It's not a movie if she's not. So I'm not saying that. Like, you know that just from watching the trailer. But there is a turn later in the movie, like I would say about 60% of the way through this movie, that I saw literally the first time that you see Greta. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily because I'm smarter than everybody else, but everything in this movie seemed pretty predictable. And I was very disappointed. I thought that the direction was pretty cool. Like, I liked how they shot the movie at the very beginning, especially with the tracking shots with the two main characters. I thought that was an interesting way to introduce the two characters. But other than that, I didn't particularly like this movie.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm surprised we're so off on it. And I'm surprised, while you were talking, I pulled up your list just out of curiosity, and I'm surprised that you put Isn't It Romantic ahead of this.
I at least laughed a couple of times during Isn't It Romantic. I only checked my watch a couple of times during that movie. I checked my watch about 10 times during Greta.
That's just surprising to me. I don't know why. I could see your point in not liking it. I think was more forgiving. There was only the one character choice that I really disagreed with, which happens to, like I said again, to set up the climax of the movie. I don't think that was needed, but for the most part, I was pretty curious what was going to happen and how things were going to end. And, you know, there were some plot points that were a bit tropey and a bit obvious. And, you know, the end of the movie, I called it in my mind, like what was going to happen.
100%.
But I still found enjoyment from like a thriller aspect. And I think it might be, like you said, it's been a weak year so far. We don't really have much to compare a lot of these movies to. But yeah, I found some enjoyment in it.
I also kind of got a kick out of the thought after I walked out of this theater. I thought that they should have a sequel or at least a stinger at the end of this movie where, and I don't know if they did have a stinger or not at the end of this movie because I didn't fucking wait around for it. But it would be funny if they had like a stinger, because at one point, I guess I'm spoiling part of this movie, but at one point she gets out from where she's at with Greta. And she literally says, "How long have I been here?" And they say, "Too long." And I think to myself, I'm like, wouldn't it be fun if they had like a Captain America-esque stinger where she's like in a different, completely like 10 years later or something crazy. And she's like walking around New York City, not knowing like what the new apps are and stuff like that. I got quite the kick out of it as we were driving home from this movie.
For what it's worth, there is no stinger in this movie.
Okay, good.
I
would have been really upset if I had missed it.
I think the website is whatsafterthecredits.com, so you can always.
I always used always use the app Run P or whatever that app is called, but they changed it a lot where you have to have like points and shit to look at stuff.
Yeah. I deleted that app as soon as I started fucking around with it, so I can't imagine many people use it anymore.
For sure.
All right, man. What are you into this week?
So I am into a video game that's been out for a while, but I just now got into it the last week or so. It's called No Man's Sky. It was a video game developed by an indie studio called Hello Games. It was originally released for PS4 and PC in 2016. It's a space sandbox survival game that is procedurally generated, which basically means that the studio, it being an indie studio, they can't sit there and develop every single planet individually. So what they did was they made an algorithm that takes things that the studio has created, like as far as plants and environments and stuff like that, and it generates it on its own. So they boast that there is 18 quadrillion planets in this game, which when I read that, it sounded like a made up number that a kid would make up to like win an argument or something like that. And it just seems super ridiculous to like boast, because there's no way that you would be able to like test that or to be able to like go to every planet. And I get that that's part of the adventure, but this video game looked really, really interesting to me when it first came out. And I was considering getting a PlayStation, not for this game, but it was right around the time that I was considering getting a PlayStation. And I was like, oh, okay, well, this might be a game that I will definitely have to check out because it looks really cool, like the aesthetic. And I do enjoy sandbox games to a certain point, and I'm a big sci-fi nerd. So a space survival sandbox game seems really interesting to me. Unfortunately, this game got fucking destroyed when it came out. There's a couple of reasons for it, but I think the main reason that most people were annoyed by and angry by was Hello Games kind of broke one of the cardinal rules when developing a game, which is they promised more than they could possibly deliver with this game, at least when it first came out. And I know one big thing that people hated about this game was the fact that they said that there was going to be multiplayer in it, and there was no multiplayer when it first released. And I understand to a certain extent promising stuff, especially early in development, and not being able to deliver on every single thing. Like, instead of making something completely open world like you would in like Red Dead or something like that, maybe making it open world in the sense that Pokemon games are open world. Like, yeah, you can go in an adventure and explore in Pokemon, but the game definitely holds your hand, especially in relation to a game like Red Dead where it doesn't hold your hand at all. So I get that, like promising it being open world but not quite delivering 100% on that promise. But when you promise multiplayer and then you release a game that has zero multiplayer aspects at all, people are going to be pretty pissed. And I know another big thing, and it's something that I've had problems with sandbox games in general. Like, I think I talked about this when I talked about Ark. I like that in these types of games, you can basically do whatever you want, but then there's nothing to do. Like, I want the game to give me some kind of narrative to tell me what to do. And there wasn't a much in this game as far as the story is concerned when it was first released in 2016. So people hated this game. But to Hello Games' credit, they stuck with it. They didn't just release it, take their 50 lashes, and move on to their next game. They apologized. They stuck with this game, and they continually updated it. And I know that one update, I think I read somewhere that one update added like 30 hours of story. And then there was another update around, I think 2018, around the same time that they released the Xbox version, which is the version that I'm playing, that's called Next, which basically added multiplayer. It added a bunch of new stuff. And basically Hello Games has come out and said that No Man's Sky Next is the game that they wanted to release in 2016. And of course, being an indie studio, they just didn't have the resources to do that in 2016. So I will say that I would like to give them props and credit for sticking with the game. Obviously, I think they would have preferred just releasing the game as it currently is in 2016 and not getting just destroyed by critics and fans alike. But you do have to give credit where credit's due, that they stuck with this game and created a really fun game. I've been really, really enjoying it so far. It's basically everything that a sci-fi nerd like myself would want in one of these games. You get to be this spaceman who has a tool that shoots lasers, and he has a jetpack, and he has a spaceship that you can jump in and basically just explore space and all these different planets. And yes, it does have the sandboxy tropes kind of thing in it, where there's a lot of grind to this game, where you have to farm minerals and stuff like that to build this new thing. But I don't mind those types of games to a certain point. I actually was kind of looking for a game when I was looking for a new game to play that I could kind of sit in a little bit longer than I'm used to. So I play a lot of story-based games that sometimes it takes 6-8 hours to beat. Sometimes it takes 30 or 40 or 50 hours to beat. But I wanted a game that I could put like 100 or 200 hours into, that I could just sit and relax and just kind of not pay a whole lot of attention to. And I feel like I'm getting a lot of that with No Man's Sky, because that's something that I've talked about before, where I tend to move on from a game earlier than I probably should. I definitely don't get my money's worth, and I kind of envy people that can play a game for 500 hours, because obviously you're getting a lot more worth out of it than I would. I know a guy at work who, we've talked about this before, where he loves Dark Souls, like he loves those games, and he's literally told me that, and this is kind of a weird thing to say about those games, but he says that he just likes playing it because it feels like home. And I kind of relate to that, because that's kind of how I watch The Office. Like, it's comfort food for me. And he loves those games so much that it's just like playing that game, because he's played it so much, feels like comfort food. And I'm not there yet with No Man's Sky, but it's definitely a game that I could see myself doing that with. Because it doesn't, because of the grind and because of the resource farming and stuff, there's been a couple hours where I can kind of shut my brain off and just relax. And it's just kind of a cool way to unwind at the end of the day, where I'm just like mining for this thing and building my base up and stuff like that. So there is some cool story elements to this game, but I find myself more just like mining and base building in this game more than anything else, and just kind of riding around in my spaceship and exploring these cool planets. So I definitely suggest, if you are a sci-fi nerd like myself and just kind of want to relax and have a game that's not going to take too much energy and too much focus, I definitely would suggest this game. And I definitely, again, want to give them credit for sticking with it and finally building the game that they wanted to put out a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. If I wasn't so backed up on my video game catalog, I'd potentially consider it. But it's also interesting that, you know, the release of this game sucked, and now it's kind of over time become a lot better. So I'm curious how many people have gone back to it and have given it another shot.
Yeah, I was actually kind of reading some reviews on, I think it was Steam or some other, maybe it was the Microsoft Store, because that's how I bought it. I bought it digitally, and a lot of people were like shitting on it still. And some of the newer reviews would be like, ignore those reviews. They're probably reviewing the game when it first came out. Like, this game is awesome, and you should definitely check it out. So I give them credit. I know that there was I think the other game that kind of came to my mind when I was thinking about like studios sticking with games that had shitty releases was the Master Chief Collection, the Halo Master Chief Collection. Because I remember when that game first came out, it was just trash because you couldn't get a game. I remember going over to your house when that game first came out. I think it was like the day of that game came out. I got off work and you were texting me like early in the day, and it was still downloading when I got off work like hours later. And then we tried to play a game and we couldn't even get into a game, and we had to play split screen that night because we just couldn't get matchmaking to work at all. And from what I understand, that game is awesome now. I don't know how many people still play it, but they've gotten a lot of those bugs fixed. And I always think that that's really cool, because a lot of people like me give up on games really easily. And so I think it's the studio, you have to give them credit when they're willing to stick with a game.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And that actually, I didn't realize the Master Chief Collection had gotten better. I'm interested in maybe potentially revisiting that, because that was a game I was really excited for. I mean, we've talked about how much Halo has meant to us in high school and growing up and college and all that good stuff. So that was a huge disappointment, but not to get too far off track.
For sure. So our next segment is just plainly called Comics. Tyler and I read a ton of comics each week, and we like to spotlight one or two an episode. So what'd you read this week?
Unfortunately, I did not read a ton of comics this week. I read one comic this week, which is the comic I'll be talking about. It didn't come out this past Wednesday. It actually came out the Wednesday before, but it's called Sharkey the Bounty Hunter, and it's a number 1. It's the first issue in a 6-issue miniseries written by Mark Miller and drawn by Simone Bianchi. So I am starting to get the feeling that Mark Miller sees himself currently as a content generator since he sold Miller World to Netflix. So in the last few years, he has been pumping out a lot of miniseries, and the skeptic in me can't help but wonder if this is out of creativity or if it's because Netflix wants a lot of content that they can flip into TV shows and movies. So it's hard to be too incredibly critical since Reborn was one of those miniseries, and I absolutely love that, and they're turning that into a movie on Netflix, but in all fairness, that was also written and distributed before the Netflix deal. But anyways, here we are with the start of another Mark Miller miniseries put out by Image Comics. So Sharkey the Bounty Hunter is about, you guessed it, a bounty hunter named Sharkey. So Sharkey is described as a blue-collar bounty hunter, and even though this book takes place in a newly created sci-fi world, there's something very familiar about the way he acts, and in fact there are a lot of familiar things about this comic that I'll get into in a moment. So Sharkey takes in a bounty in this issue 1 and ends up getting saddled with this 10-year-old nephew of the convict that he turns in, that he agrees to take to the 10-year-old's nearest living family, which is light years away. And that's pretty much the gist of the entire book, with some witty dialogue and some alien sex scenes thrown in for good measure. So a moment ago, I said a lot of this book feels familiar, and that's because I feel like we've heard this story 1,000 times. Sure, the characters are new, but this comic feels like it's full of tropes, and it's really hard to be invested in the story. So I do appreciate that this is a sci-fi book, but it doesn't feel any different from a Western or some kind of bounty hunter story that we've seen before. So, Sharkey wears a cowboy hat, but that doesn't really make a lot of sense since he's in space and he's an alien. So this comic actually reminds me a lot of Alita, which is that it's all style and no substance. So the art's amazing, and Simone Bianchi does an amazing job giving this sci-fi world life, but nothing of interest happens, and I couldn't help but think about how this comic is just content. So, for example, while I was just kind of talking about the comic, I just went to the Image Comics website, and in the last part of the synopsis for this book, it says, in all caps, Hollywood news, Netflix's latest live-action project from Mark Miller. Read the comic before you see the movie. So, I don't know. Mark Miller's been a creative genius with some of the things he's written, like Kick-Ass and obviously Kingsman. And he did Old Man Logan, and he's done a lot of awesome stuff. But I imagine him at this point locked up in a cell somewhere at Netflix's headquarters, pumping out script after script and comic after comic for the execs there so that they can try to find something that hits.
Yeah, so when you first started talking about this book, I actually did hear about it beforehand, and I immediately thought of Armagon from TMNT, because I thought that you were going to talk about how he's a bounty hunter, but he's half shark because of his name, and half human. Like, that's immediately what I thought of, and so that was kind of strange to me because that's literally what Armagon from TMNT is. He's a half shark, half man bounty hunter. So I thought that was kind of odd. But I mean, obviously that's not the case. That was immediately what came into my brain when you first started talking about this book. So it definitely seems weird that his name would be Sharky and he has nothing to do with a shark. So that bothers me a little bit. But yeah, I felt this way for a while. And I've talked about this before with like Seth Grahame-Smith, because he sells a lot of his books to be adapted into movies, and it's hard reading his books without that in the back of your head. And I think it's definitely becoming a thing with Miller.
Yeah, it's disappointing because I think that he writes a lot of great stuff, or he has written a lot of great stuff, but he's succumbed to the Hollywood side of all this, and now he's I'm assuming he's some kind of exec at Netflix. At the very least, he cashed a big check from them. So I'm curious to see. I don't know how this all plays out and how they end up doing things with his creative work from like a TV show and a movie standpoint. So we'll see.
For sure. So from one comic creator that has kind of morphed into a TV movie producer to another, I'm going to talk about Oblivion Song, which is written by Robert Kirkman, who has done a lot of work, obviously, most notably with The Walking Dead. He created that comic, and of course, he's a producer on the show. Oblivion Song, the art was done by Lorenzo Di Felici. While I talked about this book a while back, I think the last time I talked about it, it was with issue 5 or 6, I can't remember, but I'm through issue 12 now. So if you haven't been listening, or maybe you didn't remember, or you're just now joining us, like this is your first couple episodes in this podcast, this book is about Philadelphia, roughly about 10 years ago. Part of that city was sucked into another dimension called Oblivion. The government did what they could to pull the citizens back, but after years of not finding people, they closed down that program. The leader of that program, Nathan Cole, refused to give up, especially considering he believed his brother was still trapped. So issue 5 or 6, the last issue that I talked about on this podcast, left off with a pretty big cliffhanger. The walls were closing in on our hero, Nathan. And I'm not going to go through each issue individually because, like I said, I've read quite a few issues since the last time that we've talked about this, but we finally found out what caused the transference, which is what they call what happened when Philly was brought into Oblivion. And I'm not reading The Walking Dead anymore. The show did exactly what I said it was never going to do for me, which is, because I soured so much on the show, I kind of got to the point where I also soured on the book a little bit as well. So I'm not reading The Walking Dead anymore, but it definitely seems to me that Kirkman likes to do this with his books, because he did it with The Walking Dead, where you find out that everybody's infected. Like, he has these big reveals in his books, and I still remember reading in The Walking Dead that everybody's infected still. Even if you're alive, you're still infected. And that was a big moment in that book. And this book, Oblivion Song, tries to do something similar, where he tells us what exactly happened with the transference. It wasn't quite the big reveal that I think Kirkman thought it was going to be, because I thought it was actually pretty obvious given what was happening with Nathan. Obviously, I'm not going to spoil it because I do enjoy this book, and I think a lot of people should be reading this book. But the big reveal wasn't as heavy as the Walking Dead reveal was, or I think that Kirkman thought it was going to be, just because, I think it was pretty obvious. But I will say that the character work that he does, especially when it comes to PTSD, he talks a lot about, and he spends a lot of time discussing the people that have been in the Oblivion for a long time, and then Nathan pulls them out, and them trying to readjust to life in the real world, and how that affects them as a person, but also their past relationships. Like, there's a guy that Nathan pulled out years ago that he was in there so long that his wife actually met somebody new, and she fell in love, and she got remarried. I don't remember, but she was with this guy for a long time, and then her ex-husband, who she assumed was dead, gets brought back, and their relationship and how they deal with him being back is really interesting to me. So yeah, the big reveal wasn't as impactful as I thought it was going to be, but the character work in these issues is really well done. I will say that issue 12 leaves off on a pretty big cliffhanger, and it's pretty stupid. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because I have enjoyed this book for the most part, but I'm really interested to see where issue 13 and 14 and 15 and so on go, because if it goes where I think it's going to go, I'm probably going to drop this book because it's pretty stupid. But again, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because I have enjoyed this book so far.
Yeah, the first time you talked about this book, it piqued my interest, and it was something that I intended to read for a while, but I just, at this point, it's at issue 12, and I'm so far behind. Unless they really stick the landing and you rave about it on a future episode, I'm probably going to go ahead and continue to not read this book, although it does sound interesting.
That's fair, and honestly, he creates so much stuff, kind of like Mark Miller, that eventually gets produced into I almost said a comic, obviously a comic, but he takes it from a comic to a TV show or a movie that I would love to see this get turned into a TV show. I think it would be really interesting.
Awesome, man. You ready for nerd news?
Yeah, what do you got this week?
So I feel like there's actually quite a bit to talk about, and we're like 42 minutes into the podcast, so I'm a little torn on if I want to take some stuff out or not, but some of this might go relatively quickly, so let's just see what happens. So obviously we'll talk about the Oscars. I think I'll save that for last, but there were a couple trailers that came out this week, and just out of curiosity, did you see either the new X-Men Dark Phoenix trailer or the new Hellboy trailer?
I saw X-Men Dark Phoenix when it came out, I think like the next day. Pretty stupid. I do not have high hopes for that movie.
No.
I'm glad that eventually, I mean, I lost the Rotten Tomatoes film draft without it anyways, but that looks like it's going to be like a 15-20%er. Like, that's how bad it looks to me. I don't know why they're doing that storyline again. They obviously couldn't stick the landing with The Last Stand, and I feel like this has the potential of being even a worse movie than that. So, it's definitely weird, and I'm not liking everything that I'm seeing about it so far. And then I hadn't seen the new Hellboy trailer until we went and saw Greta last night. And then I saw it, and I'm kind of backpedaling a little bit. I still think it looks fun, but I don't know. His prosthetics look off to me, and every time I see him, it just looks kind of silly and cheap. So that's going to bother me a little bit, but
Was it the red band trailer or was it the green band trailer?
I saw the green band trailer.
Okay.
But it was a different trailer than I saw previous, than the teaser that we got a couple of months ago that I thought looked really, really fun. I still think it's fun. I still think it looks good, but it definitely has that Men in Black. It kind of reminded me a little of The Mummy, the Tom Cruise Mummy, just the way that they created some of the monsters kind of looks a little similar to me, or to me. But it definitely has the potential of being really bad, but I hope that it kind of leans into the campy feel and is as fun as the teaser trailer originally made it, to me at least, seem like.
Yeah, so I watched the red band trailer this morning to prepare to talk about it, and I think that it will be an average movie. Like, I don't think it's going to be as terrible as I may have said that it was probably going to be when that first trailer came out. I enjoyed some of the red band aspects to it, including the cursing, but I'm having a hard time understanding David Harbour when he talks, and I don't know if that's something they'll continue to fix and tweak and post, but I think the prosthetics are mumbling his voice a little bit, and like you said, I feel like his face looks off, which is no disrespect to David Harbour, but I think that they're trying to make it look like Hellboy, but they're also trying to make it not look like Ron Perlman. So I don't know. I'm going to hope that it's bad for Rotten Tomatoes' sake, but I don't know. I don't know. There could be some fun to be had.
Yeah, as far as the prosthetics are concerned, obviously I love the original Planet of the Apes, and it was revolutionary for its time, but you can definitely tell, obviously, that there's like this plastic prosthetic on their face to make them look like apes. And that's what Hellboy looks like. Every time he talks, it looks like he's not moving his face. There's something on top of his face that's moving because he's moving his face, if that makes any sense. And it just doesn't look natural and real to me. I know that being a film buff, that obviously that's not his face, and that they had to do some prosthetics to make it look good. I'm glad that they're trying to do it practically. I appreciate that, but it still has to look good. And I just don't think, just judging by the trailers, that it looks good.
Yeah, no, I agree. Really quick for the X-Men trailer, I agree with everything you said. I don't think that it's going to be good at all. But it does look like Jennifer Lawrence found a way out of her contract to come back and get killed off. So good for her.
Yeah, that was the thing that I just don't understand. Like, why come back for such a shitty looking movie?
I'm sure it's all contract stuff. Or wait, she was out of her contract, wasn't she? And
Yeah, Apocalypse was it for her. So they must have just fucking took a dump truck to her front door, just filled with cash.
Or again, you know, the character gets killed off in the trailer. Like, I can't imagine she's in that movie that much. So now she never has to worry about being brought back, I guess. I don't know. We'll see.
I mean, the deal with Fox is going to close at the end of the month, as far as I understand. We've heard that before. So who cares? This is going to be the last one anyways.
Sure.
I just don't understand why she would ever come back.
For sure.
I can't imagine she's hurting for money.
No. Good point. So, I don't know, man. The last few stories I have kind of tie to the Oscars a little bit. So, I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about Pokemon Direct. So, I'll turn it over to you for that, and then we can wrap up Nerd News with a couple of stories that kind of tie to the Oscars.
Yeah, okay. So, I'll talk about Pokemon Direct, which I talked about the Nintendo Direct a little bit ago. So I'm not used to doing nerd news this quickly, like in quick succession. But Pokemon, it was a big announcement, so they went ahead and did kind of a miniature Nintendo Direct on Wednesday for it. And we finally got an official announcement for the Pokemon RPG that they've been teasing for the Nintendo Switch. Now, for those that are kind of just more casual fans, you're probably thinking, well, we already have a Pokemon game for the Switch, but that was essentially a remake of the first gen Pokemon game, and it was kind of a hybrid between Pokemon Go and Pokemon. And the new Pokemon game that they're calling, in typical Pokemon fashion, there's two games, Pokemon Sword and Shield. This is going to be more of a traditional Pokemon RPG that hardcore fans, OG Pokemon players, will appreciate. It follows the new Galar region, and of course, with it being a new region, there are going to be new Pokemon, including new starters. And I'm going to butcher these names, and I apologize. So the grass Pokemon, the starter will be Grookey, the fire will be Scarbunny, and then the water will be Subble, something like that. And for me, and I've tweeted a lot about this, so for those that follow us on Twitter at the Nerds Podcast, you know that I was pretty disappointed. The starters for me look pretty generic. I really hope that they evolve into something cool, but I was pretty disappointed with those starters. They didn't give us an official release date yet. They've been teasing this for a couple of years now, and they've been saying 2019. And so I was really looking forward to getting an official date. All they said was late 2019. So I was pretty disappointed because that was something that I already knew. So I was pretty disappointed by that. And we still have random encounters, which I'm very disappointed in. So when they first announced Pokemon Let's Go, I was like, okay, well, they're getting rid of the random encounters, which I thought at the time, it's funny because I thought that sucks. Like, that's not the Pokemon game that I want or am used to. And then I started playing Let's Go, and I was like, it's actually pretty cool that we don't have random encounters because I can go through this grass patch and I could see exactly the Pokemon that's in it. And I know that, okay, if I don't need to catch it for any reason, then I can just like move away from it. And it feels really cool. It feels like you're more in control. And I really appreciated that. And so I've kind of flipped how I feel about random encounters now. And I was very disappointed that they brought it back. Like, I felt like, yes, there were some OG Pokemon players that put a lot of pressure after Let's Go came out, and they were complaining about the random encounters, and I was one of them. But after playing it, I thought that was actually a one of the best parts of that game. And it's one of the things that I bring up the most when I talk about Let's Play, or not, Let's Go. And I was kind of hoping that they would bring it to this game. So I was a little bit disappointed with that. But there is a screenshot that they showed that leads me to believe there's going to be some Pokemon Stadium stuff in this game, which I'm excited for. I did play that game on N64 when it came out years ago, and so I think it would be kind of a cool new aspect that they could bring to it. Overall, I was pretty disappointed with the Pokemon Direct.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to think of something to say here. I don't know. I plan to get a Switch in the next couple months, so it might be a game that I pick up whenever it's released. It sounds like later this year, but I don't know, man. I don't know if I'm into it, so we'll see.
All right, cool, man. So, Oscars.
Yeah, so one of these stories I will incorporate into the actual story where we're going to talk about some of the winners, but the one that I want to bring up beforehand is, it was trending on Twitter yesterday. Apparently, Steven Spielberg is not a fan of Netflix. He wants to, I guess he's like the lead of the director board for the Academy, and he is proposing that new rules be put in place that prevent Netflix from ever being considered for Oscars, and that what they do are more TV movies as opposed to actual cinematic movies. So I think that this has been met with a lot of outcry, and I'm curious to see how far it goes. But I'm obviously bring this up to be able to put our opinions out there. So what do you think?
I think it's, as much as I respect the movies that he has made, he made a lot of the movies that I grew up on and love as a kid, but he is 1,000% wrong. There's already rules in place that movies have to adhere to be even considered, and that's what Roma did, to be considered. So they had a theatrical release, which I don't know why I struggle saying that word, but they had a release in New York and LA because that's what the Oscars, I mean, you have to do that. The OJ documentary on 30 for 30 that won a couple of years ago for Best Documentary, it did the same thing because you have to do that. And a lot of theaters in New York and LA show a lot of these shorts because they have to do it as well. So they followed all the rules. So there's already rules in place. This is something that I had prepared to talk about. One thing that I hated about the Oscars was the fact that Green Book won, and it felt like the old guard not wanting Black Panther to win because it's Marvel, or Roma to win because it's Netflix. And I mean, I know we're going to get into the Oscars more heavily here shortly, so I'll leave some of that stuff for later, but this is so silly to me. It's the old guard not wanting to change. And 10 years from now, when Netflix is putting out movies and getting acclaim for some of the movies that they put out, it's going to seem silly that people like this, like Steven Spielberg, are fighting against it. It just seems silly to me. Just change, man.
Well, I mean, in like 10 years, he might be dead, so he might not have to worry about it. So we'll see. But I don't know. I obviously definitely agree with you. I think that he's being resistant because people want to protect the movie-going experience, which obviously you and I are huge fans of. Like, you,
for sure,
you're on pace to see 100 movies in theaters this year, and last year I think that I went to the theater nearly 80 times. So obviously that's a hobby that you and I both enjoy. But why would you want to restrict or thwart someone's creativity by putting that limitation on it? And to be honest with you, I don't even really get why TV movies aren't part of the Oscars to begin with. If you want to label a Netflix movie as a TV movie, I just don't understand. It's the Academy of Motion Picture, right? So where in that does it say it has to be through a movie theater? I think that that's dumb, and I think that that's, like you said, an old way of thinking. And once the new guard kind of takes over, I definitely imagine this won't even be a conversation. But for now, it's pretty silly.
And honestly, I think it's one of the things that holds the Oscars back, or has been holding the Oscars back for a couple of years now, or even longer than that. The new generation, we don't see, I guess I shouldn't put myself in that category because I do like to see movies in theaters, but a majority of the people don't see movies in theaters anymore. That's not something that they do anymore. They rent it on video on demand, or they wait for it to be on Netflix. So the Oscars is never going to be the spectacle that it wants to be. Not that I think that it should necessarily, quote unquote, dumb it down for the general audience. I still think that it should be a showcase of the best movies, or at least, like, technically speaking, the best movies. But until they embrace the new guard, they're never going to be the spectacle that it wants to be or it used to be.
No, I 100% agree. And I think that that's probably a good segue into talking about the Oscars. So I think we've said it before on the podcast. The Oscars are something that we enjoy watching, and it's always fun to see who the winners are and that kind of stuff. But over time, I think that you and I have both put a lot less stock into who the Academy tells us is great, because we want to make those decisions for ourselves. So that being said, we're not going to run through every category. That would take too long, and we're almost at an hour anyways. But I do want to just rattle off a couple of the bigger winners and talk about the Oscar show as a whole. So how do you want to do it first? You want me to go through a couple of the winners, or are you interested in just kind of saying your piece on the show itself?
I'll just go ahead and knock out the show in general. I thought it moved so much better, or so much smoother without a host. I think, again, kind of talking about old guard versus new guard, this is something that hasn't worked for a long time, having a host, because the Oscars isn't the spectacle that it used to be. So why have a host run the whole show when you can just do the tiny bits that they were doing throughout the show, and those worked better than anything that you could have had a host do. So I think that it ran smoother. We got to the awards quicker, it felt like, and I'm glad that they decided not to cut things out, because it felt like them cutting stuff out and, like, editing it and putting it out later, that felt like it was overcorrecting. I think you try the no host thing and see how it works, and see if that's the correction that you need to make, because, I mean, they kind of fell ass backwards into it because nobody wanted to do it after the Kevin Hart stuff, but I think it was the best possible solution to the whole thing.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I was almost dreading last Sunday night because I had to be up really early Monday for work. And I was like, this isn't going to get over till after midnight, my time. And it moved so quick that I was super happy about that. So I think it worked out really well. I think you just get really funny presenters, and you give them a little bit more time to do stuff like they did with Amy Poehler, Maya Rudolph, and Tina Fey, and do it that way. Like, we don't need them to bring pizza to the Oscars, as a witty segment halfway through it, like they've done in the past. Just, as me and my wife say, get to the beans. Like, fucking show us the important stuff.
That is a weird expression, get to the beans. That's so weird.
So
I'm glad that you preface that by saying me and my wife say get to the beans, because nobody else says it.
It's actually, so did you ever see the movie Rough Night?
No, I don't think so.
So it's that movie with Scarlett Johansson and Alana Glazer's in it, and a few other actresses, and Gillian Hall. I think it's Gillian Hall, who was on Workaholics, and she's done some other stuff. So this is so random and so dumb, but there's a a segment or a part of the movie where there's a male stripper, because it's a bachelorette party, and Julian Hall's character says, "Get to the beans, get to the beans, get to the beans," referencing his testicles, of course. And so now whenever we need somebody to get to the point, we say, "Get to the beans." So that's a little insight to the insanity of our household.
Yeah, that's super weird.
All right, so now that we've said our piece about the show and that we like the runtime, let's talk about a couple of the winners. Again, we won't get too in-depth here. I think Pat Life tweeted some of it, so you can see his thoughts as well on the Twitter. Why did I say on the Twitter? I sounded so old there. But yeah, I'm just on the Oscars website, so I'm not going into any particular order, but we'll talk about like the actors, actresses, and Best Picture is kind of what I'm thinking, unless there's something else you want to bring up. But spoiler alert for Nerd Favorite, I will be asking you what your favorite moment from the Oscars was, so if you want to save that for the last segment, that'd be great. So performances in a leading role. That for male, it was Rami Malek for Bohemian Rhapsody. So I was pretty pissed that he won.
100%.
I put something from The Onion on our Facebook, and it didn't get a single like, which hurt my feelings a little bit. But it was basically something along the lines of, for his performance in Bohemian Rhapsody, Rami Malek had to deeply immerse himself as a person who didn't know about Bryan Singer's child molestation charges or something like that. So didn't get a lot of love. And my question to you was, how unbearable has it been living in Evansville for the last week with people basically claiming this win is their own because he went to the University of Evansville?
Oh, it's been excruciating. I didn't know this at the time, but apparently they had Oscar viewing parties. Not that that's a thing that people hadn't done until this year, but it's obviously a pretty popular thing, people having Oscar parties. But there was literally a group downtown, I think, that charged people, and they had like served food and like they watched the Oscar. It was super weird, and I don't think that they've done that before. So that was definitely a big deal because, I mean, University of Evansville, for those that don't know, have a pretty prestigious theater program. So there's been a couple of people that are big deals that have graduated from University of Evansville. I didn't go to University of Evansville, so I don't particularly give a shit about that, and I don't have any real connection to Evansville as a whole, so I don't care. But yeah, it's been pretty excruciating to listen to people talk about how it's like, he won one for us. The dude is a immigrant from Egypt. He's not, it's not one of us.
No, he doesn't give a fuck about Evansville. Like, he got his degree and he bounced. So ease up, guys. Ease up, Hoosiers.
For sure.
So let's see. For female, for actress, it was Olivia Colman for The Favorite, which I feel so bad for Glenn Close. She got
100%
fucked, man. Like, she's won every award, and Olivia Colman came out of nowhere, and Glenn Close has never won an Oscar. That's tough. It reminds me of when a Sylvester Stallone didn't win a couple years ago, and he was the favorite, because he's never going to get one.
Yeah, but I've heard a lot of people talk about and make this point. I haven't seen The Wife, so I can't comment on whether or not I think that it's her best performance or anything like that. But I've heard other people make the point that, was she just winning because she never won before? Like, because she has this huge track record? And we've had this discussion before with other people, especially with Leo, him not winning one. Was this really her best performance? And did she really deserve, out of all of her performances, to win for The Wife? Or was it because she has this track record and people think that she should get it, so we might as well give it to her this year? Because these aren't Lifetime Achievement Awards.
No, I think that's definitely a fair point, and I think that if it had been something else, someone else besides Olivia Colman, like, honestly, Lady Gaga, or from what I've seen, Yalitza Aparicio, anybody else besides Olivia Colman would have won. I probably wouldn't have had as much beef, but I hated The Favorite so much that I just didn't want her to win, I guess, and that's cruel of me.
That's fair. I actually haven't seen either one of them. I haven't seen Glenn Close in The Wife or The Favorite. So.
Sure. So let's move on to Best Supporting. So male, Mahershala Ali, who we're going to talk about momentarily, for True Detective, won for Green Book. I mean,
he was the best part of that movie, even though I didn't particularly like that movie.
Yeah, I mean, he was the favorite to win. I don't think that I would have been super upset if anybody in that category won, because I liked all of the performances that I saw. So it is what it is. And then female was Regina King, If Beale Street Could Talk, which, again, she was the favorite. So I've not seen the movie, but I tend to like her as an actress, so I'm good there too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I know that Twitter exploded when Chris Evans helped her up the stage. Everybody's saying, like, Chris Evans is actually Captain America in real life. I actually, my wife and I were joking about because he didn't help her up the last couple of stairs. And I just, in my head, I thought it would be funny if she, like, tripped at the last, like, stair because he didn't help her up. But that's just because I'm a weirdo.
Quick sidebar. Why the fuck was he in the front row? He had no business
I have no
there.
idea.
No business at all.
Didn't he present later on, and maybe they just wanted him closest? I don't know how that works.
I think they probably.
But he's also a super famous and good-looking guy, so
yeah. I mean, I get that side of it, but just strange to me. So, you know, there's a lot of other big categories we could talk about. I think that we probably have the same opinions on a lot of them, but the last one, obviously, that I want to bring up, and then if you want to talk about anything that I didn't bring up, you can, is obviously Best Picture, which was won by Green Book, which, since that happened, a lot of people have shared varying opinions on it. So I think you and I are probably on the same page, but feel free to go right ahead.
So obviously I was pretty shocked and angry that it won, but as you kind of touched on a little bit while you were talking about the Oscars, we definitely don't think of the Oscars like we used to. I don't think that just because you won Best Picture, you are the best movie that year. I know a lot more about how it works, especially for Best Picture. I know a lot about how the voting works, and it's really fucking convoluted, and it's really stupid. If you do want to find more, I'm going to kind of give a little general overview of how it works to prove my point that Green Book should have never won. But if you do want more information, there is a YouTuber that I watch pretty much on the daily, Philip DeFranco, who did a deep dive into this right before the Golden Globes and the Oscars, like, award season really started. He did a deep dive on it, and it was really, really fascinating. So I'll just kind of break it down real quick. Hypothetically, if there's 10 nominations, what voters will do for Best Picture is they will take those 10 nominations and they will put it from their favorite being 1 to their least favorite being 10. And the way that it works is if you're number 1, say I picked Black Panther or whatever as my number 1. If my number 1 doesn't get a certain percentage, which I believe, if I remember correctly, it's 10% of the rest of the vote, it gets eliminated as my number 1 pick. So basically they take my number 1 pick and they make my second pick my number 1 pick. And if my second pick doesn't get 10% or whatever the percentage is of number 1 picks, then it gets eliminated, and it just keeps going through and through. And so what people can do, obviously, because that's a super convoluted way to vote on something, people can, that have actually a dog in the fight, they can cheat essentially the system in a way that if they didn't want Black Panther to win because it's Marvel, or Roma to win because it's Netflix, they could make it 9 and 10, even though it doesn't deserve to be 9 or 10. They could make it 9 or 10, or in this case, it was like 7 or 8, because I think there was only like 8 nominations this year for Best Picture, just to throw off the percentage. So Roma, even if it was a bunch of people's number 1 pick, if it was a couple of people or several people's 7 or 8 pick, then it could eliminate it from contention for Best Picture. And so there are stories of people doing that in the past. And that's the only way that I can fathom that Green Book would win. Because I can't imagine that there's that many people out there objectively that saw Green Book and saw all of these nominations that would objectively say that it was the best picture this year.
Sure. So I definitely think that's pretty interesting, and I've heard that before. So I think that's why we see surprises in this category somewhat often. But for me, I think looking at the nominees, this would have been my 5th pick?
I actually did look at all the nominees, and it would have been my fifth pick. I would have done Black Panther. I don't know why I said that so weird. Roma, Black Klansman, A Star Is Born, then Green Book.
Gotcha. Yeah, I didn't see Roma, so unfortunately I don't put that ahead of Green Book, but I would have said Black Panther, Black Klansman, Vice, A Star Is Born, Green Book. So that's kind of where I was at with it. So yeah, I mean that's the Oscars, man. Any other closing thoughts? We'll talk about it again when we talk about our favorite moment, but
I want to point out that because Green Book won for Best Writing and Best Picture, Nick Vallelonga has more Oscars than Stanley Kubrick right now. And that, for me, just blows my fucking mind.
And Spike Lee.
Yeah, that's true as well, because Spike Lee won his first for Best Director this year.
And Martin Scorsese.
Yeah, that's true as well. I think
could keep going.
Could go on. The list could go on and on. I will say that if there's one good thing about Green Book winning Best Picture is that maybe people will dive more into Nick Vallelonga and find out that he has done a Christmas album, because I think more people need to listen to that Christmas album.
That's news to me, man, but you bet your ass I'm going to listen to it.
Yeah, it's quite the gem.
Awesome, man. Well, that was long, but that was also nerd news.
All right, so our main topic, finally. This is usually how long the episode as a whole normally are, and we're just now getting to our main topic. So we might be short on our main topic this week, just to kind of keep the episode at a reasonable length. But we are going to be reviewing True Detective Season 3, which, if you're not familiar, True Detective is an anthology crime show on HBO that when Season 1 was first released, I believe in 2014, it just took pop culture and the internet by storm. I remember I didn't have HBO at the time, and it was still kind of the tail end of when I was buying TV on DVD. And I think we actually reviewed the first season when the Blu-ray came out. And I remember that this was such a big deal when it first got released that like actors and actresses that had nothing to do with True Detective were like going on talk shows that I watched and talking about how much they love True Detective, and the hosts were talking about it on their like the monologue and stuff, and I was having to like fast forward through shit just so it wouldn't be spoiled for me because I didn't have HBO at the time. And so I just remember it being such a big deal and us reviewing it on, I think as a bonus episode, because I think we were still bi-weekly at the time. Don't go back and listen to it, because if I remember correctly, we didn't really know how to do reviews for TV yet. I think we had only done maybe like one other review for TV. And so we literally went through episode by episode, and it was like a full length episode just on True Detective Season 1. And it's probably pretty bad. So I definitely wouldn't suggest going and listening to the episode. But unfortunately, Season 2 got trashed pretty bad. I had heard horrible things, and at the time I just had so much to watch that I was just like, oh, well, it's getting trashed. I don't have any, like, as much as I enjoyed Season 1, I didn't really have a whole lot of connection to the show because it's an anthology series. So I was just like, okay, well, that's one less thing that I have to watch now.
Yeah, I mean, same situation here. I didn't watch Season 2. I think I watched the first episode and then just decided not to continue with it. But I did like Season 1. It holds a special place in my heart because I got the Blu-ray, right, whenever my wife and I bought our first house, and I watched it as I put together our furniture because I didn't have internet yet. So I didn't have Netflix or anything. So that was obviously a cool time in my life when we bought our first home together. So it was also a really good season of television. So I had heard that Season 3 was good, so I was excited to binge it this past week.
For sure. So Season 3 stars Mahershala Ali, which I mean, I nailed that, right?
Yeah, good job.
I've been practicing. Also, we've been having to say his name a lot because of the Oscars and Green Book and Alita, so I've kind of had a lot of practice. So it stars him and Stephen Dorff as Detective Hayes and West, who must investigate the disappearance of two children. Like I said, I never saw Season 2, but I heard that this was going to be a a quote unquote return to form. So I was definitely intrigued by it. And let's be honest, there wasn't a whole lot this week for us to talk about. So this was a pretty easy choice for us to review this.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
All right, so before we get started, I do want to say that Netflix's Skip the Intro has really spoiled me because I've been rewatching Game of Thrones on HBO right now as well. And it just, as I was watching Game of Thrones and then, of course, watching this, it pisses me off that I can't skip the intro. I don't need you to tell me what happened on the last episode that I literally just fucking watched.
Yeah, I have the Apple TV, so you can skip ahead 15 seconds at a time, so that makes it helpful. But honestly, if I went back and rewatched Game of Thrones, I'd probably watch the intro every time. I love that fucking intro.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily the intro that bothers me, because I do watch the intro sometimes.
Sure.
But it's the previously on.
Yeah. This is a sidebar conversation again, but the previously on can sometimes spoil what's going to happen in the episode too if they reach back too
100%.
far. Like, why would you be
100%.
showing me this if this isn't important? So,
absolutely.
Okay, so True Detective season 3, you ready to get into broad strokes?
Yeah, how'd you feel about it?
So, like I was saying, I had heard that this was a return to form for True Detective and that this season was more akin to the fantastic first season. As opposed to that mediocre second season we were talking that, again, I never watched. So for the most part, I'd say that I agree with that. This season doesn't surpass the first season in terms of quality, but I was surprised at how much I ended up liking it. There were some plot points that I wasn't crazy about, but as I've kind of reflected on the season, I appreciate that it was more about how people are impacted by trauma than it was about telling some crazy detective story with some absurd resolution.
Yeah, I think you might be a little bit more positive than me, but I think we're pretty close overall on how I feel about this show. So, like I said before, I never saw season 2, so I can't really talk about whether or not it's a return to form or not. But after watching the entire season, it's an above average season of TV. It's nowhere as exciting as I thought season 1 was. And I understand that this show is definitely, even in season 1, which I thought was really exciting, even in that season, it's more about the journey than it is necessarily the destination. But unfortunately, a lot of this felt like filler to me. And we've discussed this with The Walking Dead and some of the Marvel Netflix shows. True Detective season 3 definitely falls in that category for me, where it was 8 episodes, but it probably should have been only 6 episodes.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's some of the points that I want to make in our story section, which I'm ready to get into if you are.
For sure, let's do it.
So like I said in broad strokes, once I got past the point of expecting this to be solely about the mystery and looked at it more from the perspective of Wayne's character arc and life, I liked this season a lot more. But with that being said, the intrigue of the mystery was still really good and kept me wanting to watch to get some type of resolution. So as good as both of those aspects are, I do feel like, similar to what you were saying, some of the episodes were basically unneeded filler. So I wish I would have written an example down that I could go back to use for an example for this, but it's kind of crazy that in what should be a tight 8-episode season, there were still points where the season dragged a little bit. I appreciate that True Detective does do the 8-episode route instead of the 10 to 13 episode route, but I think that there was definitely room for some 45-minute episodes instead of the hour-plus episodes that we got. A sidebar, again, I feel like I keep saying sidebar through this episode, but I feel like we say that a lot when we review TV shows, and I'm really curious if that's something that tends to be wrong with hour-long dramas now, or if our taste and our attention span has changed or decreased given the amount of content that there's available to consume. So I don't know, maybe we just don't have the patience anymore, and I guess that's my take on it. But back to True Detective, I guess. So the story is told over the course of different times from 1980 to 2015, and most of the story takes place in 1980, 1990, and 2015, and the show bounces back and forth between those timelines each episode. I think that it works pretty well as we try to put the puzzle pieces together and reconstruct the past with what we're shown. And it's honestly very similar to what the Wayne character is doing in 2015, since he's struggling with dementia and has a hard time remembering things. But there is a problem with this type of storytelling. Basically, you know beats with each time period because of what you're finding out in the future. So, for example, you know that the case isn't solved appropriately as of 2015, so there won't be any type of resolution in those time periods, which kind of lowers the stakes for me. So I definitely found myself caring more about the 2015 story and being more enamored with the destination instead of the journey, something that you had kind of mentioned in your broad strokes. But once I got past that, when I saw the season was much more about the personal stories and connections that I mentioned earlier instead of the case itself, that alleviated some of that, but it was still something I struggle with as I watched the season.
100%. That's actually my first note, and I'm glad that you brought it up, was that even though I loved how they bounced back and forth, because that's definitely a callback to the first season, which we're kind of just ignoring the second season since neither one of us has seen it, but it wears thin really quickly. And I mean, I've talked about this before with fast forwards in shows or flash forwards. It spoils stuff for you for the rest of the season or the rest of the movie or whatever it is, because that character, at the end is going to live through this or whatever, because you've already seen him in the future. And so that's definitely something that happens a lot in this show. And one thing that really bothered me about it was it felt like the show tried to build tension. So they did this a lot where they would kind of just leave a time period off on kind of a cliffhanger and then go to a different time period. And it felt like because they kept doing that, I wasn't really paying too much attention to what was happening on the screen. I just wanted them to go back to the other time period where they were doing something interesting and they left it off on a cliffhanger. And I didn't understand why they did that. And then, of course, there was just a couple of story arcs. Because there's so many different characters, there's always going to be story arcs that I just don't particularly care that much about. And one that I just didn't have any emotional attachment to whatsoever was his wife. Like, that whole story arc about her writing the book just never really interested me at all. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the way that the show framed him, I think that they framed him in a way that he's supposed to be the bad guy in that situation. And I felt like I agreed with him a lot in that arena as far as that story arc is concerned. I understand her point of view. And one thing that I think, and this is obviously more personal, but I think anytime you watch something, you're always going to relate to yourself. But one thing that makes my marriage work so well is because we both have our own thing. Like, obviously I have the podcast and the YouTube channel and all that stuff. My wife has her art. Like, we go to Indie PopCon every year. She goes to these different art festivals throughout the year and sells her art. And that's kind of her thing. And I think it's definitely important to have your own thing. But her thing clearly is counterproductive to his career. Like, he has worked his entire life and has made all these sacrifices to get where he is currently. And then she fucks him so hard by writing this stupid fucking book. And that really bugged me. And the way that the show framed him as kind of being the bad guy for not understanding that she needed this other thing and that she wasn't just going to be a wife and watch the kids and stuff like that while he went out and did his job. And I totally understand that. Like, I get that thought process, but maybe do something that doesn't fuck his job. And so I just felt like I was agreeing with him more and more, and the show doesn't, at least I didn't interpret it, it doesn't frame it in a way that we're supposed to agree with him. And I just kind of felt like that throughout the whole show, that I just didn't understand why they were doing that. And I'm glad that you brought up the memory loss stuff, because that was probably my favorite stuff in this whole season, was that arc. And it just, again, kind of going to more of a personal route. That's like one of my greatest fears in life, is to grow up and be that guy that can't remember his life. Because even though I did play a lot of sports in high school, I was awful at it. I'm just like a tiny guy, and I'm just not like, I was never very athletic. Every time I describe my like athletic career, I always think of the George Bluth quote, "You were just a turd out there." And that's kind of how I was. And the reason I bring that up is because really my memory and my quick wit is all I have, because I never really had any like artistic ability. I never really had any athletic ability, but I was always like one of the smartest and kind of, and it sounds douchey to say that, but like one of the more clever people in the room. And I could always talk really well. So, well, for the most part. And for me, if I were to ever lose that, like that, I would lose part of my identity. And so I really connected with that part of the show, because that's definitely him being a detective. He obviously has to have that. And so for me to watch that, it was like my worst nightmare come true. And that really connected to me on an emotional level. And that was the best part of the show for me. And then one final thought before we move on. I really appreciated that this show wasn't about pedophiles. Like, this show is definitely about the journey and not necessarily the destination. The destination was disappointing ultimately for me, but I did appreciate that it wasn't about pedophiles like this first season was.
For sure.
All right, so performances. How'd you feel about season 3 of True Detective?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a ton here. I thought that the performances were really great for the most part. I would say Mahershala Ali is definitely creeping up as one of my favorite actors. Like, he continually
For sure
delivers amazing performances in everything he does, and he's amazing here. So definitely good stuff from him. I didn't have huge expectations for Steven Dorff, but I thought that he was also great. Like, he's opposite an amazing actor. Not that he's not, but you know, he had a pretty big role to fill here, and I think that he delivers. You know, the supporting cast is also fine. I could go through name by name. I guess like 2 other people to make sure to call out would obviously be Carmen Ejogo, who plays Amelia. I thought that she was fine. She reminds me a lot of Tessa Thompson, but I thought that she was pretty good opposite Mahershala. And then is his name really Scoot McNairy?
Yep.
Who plays Tom Purcell. I thought that he was also really great. He was good in Argo, and it was cool to see him here. So I again, don't really have many complaints from a performance perspective. I thought that it was pretty great all around.
I will say, just a small note, I pretty much agree with everything that you just said. I will say that I think that he did, I don't know if he was trying to do an accent or something, but he had a little bit of a mumble to him. And there was a couple of times where we had to rewind. And there was especially one point where we actually had to rewind a couple of times, and then we just gave up and put the closed captioning on for a particular scene, because he had a slight mumble, and sometimes it was kind of hard to understand what he was saying. But other than that, I thought he was fantastic. Scoot, I completely agree with it. That's a stupid fucking name. But I thought that he was really good in this show, especially the interrogation scene. One small note, and I don't even know if this is necessarily his fault. I think I put more of it on the director, because sometimes it's the director's job to kind of rein in the actor a little bit. I do think that as that scene went on, Scoot went a little overboard. He overacted a little bit, and again, he was fantastic pretty much the entire season. So I think that was more on the director not reining him in a little bit. So I put that more on the director, but everybody else was fantastic. I will say, and this is not a performance thing, but Steven Dorff's hair looked really stupid. I don't know if it was a hairpiece or just the way that they styled it. It was very distracting. It was mostly when they went, I think it was in the 80s, right? The first case was in the 80s.
Yeah.
When they did that stuff, it looked really fucking stupid.
That's what I think was funny. It was especially differentiating between 80 and 90. Because that's only a decade apart. Was like, well, we got to find a way to let the audience know what year we're in. So, Steven Dorff, that's going to be your hair, man. Like, that's how the audience will tell.
Yeah, for sure. So that's not really performance, but it was definitely something that I noticed.
Cool. So I don't know if you were thinking anything for like another section, or if you just wanted to go to notable episodes.
given the time that we've already talked in this episode, I think we'll just go ahead and go to notable episodes.
Okay, and for brevity, I will just pick one notable episode because there was just really one, honestly, that I wanted to be sure to call out, and that was episode 5, which is entitled If You Have Ghosts. And the reason that I wanted to call this episode out was because it included probably the most thrilling part of the season for me, which was the shootout between the rednecks and between the police and between the Native American character. I can't remember his name, unfortunately, but I thought that scene and that entire scenario was really well done. And after, it's kind of the cliffhanger of episode 4, and I was worried that they weren't going to show it. And that episode 5 starts with them showing off pictures of the aftermath. So I was really pleased that they decided to show us everything that happened in that situation, which again was pretty edge of your seat stuff, even though certain characters are going to make it out alive.
So I actually picked episode 4 because I think this show is definitely a very slow burn, and episode 4 was when everything started to come together. One thing that I wanted to bring up in the story, and I just forgot to do, is I liked how this show punished the two for kind of being pieces of shit. And you see that a little bit in episode 4 where they kind of railroad that kid in the interrogation room, and that comes back to haunt them a little bit. And they're not good cops. Like, throughout this investigation, they're not good cops. But I really liked how this show kind of punished them for not being good, and you see that a little bit in episode 4. I will say that episode 5, them not giving us the conclusion, because they end episode 4 on that cliffhanger, them not giving us that right off the bat, I thought was really, really shitty, the way that they started episode 5. Like, you can't end episode 4 on a cliffhanger and then not give us the conclusion of that right off the bat. Because there are some people, unlike us, that didn't binge this in a week. There's some people that watched it week to week, and I would have been so pissed if I was watching this week to week, and they finally gave us something super interesting and super action-packed, and I had to wait 20 minutes to actually see the conclusion.
Sure. No, I get where you're coming from, but at least it came in episode 5 and not like episode 6 or 7.
For sure. And then I did pick another episode. I'm just going to, kind of a cop-out, pun intended, I picked the season finale just because I did think it was weird once we finally got the conclusion. Even though I thought it was pretty lackluster, I will say that it went on for too long. Like, it felt like it could have ended a couple of times, and then they just kept going and going, and the further they went down that rabbit hole, the less and less I cared. So the season finale was a little bit disappointing for me.
What's funny is before I decided to cut an episode for brevity, that was the episode I was going to choose. So I definitely agree from a certain standpoint, but I also like how a lot of the unsolved mysteries that you get the answers to in the season finale turn out to not be really mysteries at all. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil anything, but I like how they played with the audience's emotions there and made us think that something was maybe omitted that we thought was maybe omitted for importance actually wasn't important at all. So that being said, you ready to put a star rating on this season?
Yeah, out of 5 stars, how'd you feel about True Detective season 3?
I am giving it a 3.5.
I do think it's worth seeing, so I'm going to give it a 3.
Perfect. So with that being said, we're going to end this longer episode with a nerd favorite, and I already spoiled what that nerd favorite was going to be, but just in case you jumped to nerd favorite and didn't listen to the rest of the episode, it is, Pat, what is your favorite moment from the Oscars this past Sunday? So I'll go first. I kind of, even though this is my question, I kind of struggled with it a little bit, and I went back and forth on a couple things, and I think that something like saying, Into the Spider-Verse winning Best Animated Picture is an easy answer because that's something that was easy to root for, but as sappy as this going to make me sound, I really liked the performance of Shallow by Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper. So I actually,
it was so awkward, man.
I not so much because they were like very intimate with one another during the performance, but because I'm not the biggest Lady Gaga fan, and I really respect Bradley Cooper as a filmmaker and think that he did a good job with A Star Is Born. But to be able to go up there and sing that song, like that's everyday life for Lady Gaga, but that's got to be something that was probably pretty uncomfortable for Bradley Cooper. And I'm impressed that he not only did it, but did it really well. And I like that they shot it from behind the piano where it was like facing the crowd. Like typically the director of an awards show doesn't get to do a lot of creative things, especially when it's live and you have to make really quick decisions. And obviously that was something that was probably premeditated, but I thought that shooting it that way added like a little extra flair to it. And like I said, I like that song. So I'm going to go with that.
I just felt like it was a little awkward. And then at one point, I think I don't know if they did it during the performance or not. I can't remember, but they like cut to Bradley Cooper's fiance or girlfriend or whoever she was. It was kind of a very awkward moment, but yeah, that's a good point. That's a good moment. I will say I'm not necessarily picking one particular moment, but kind of going back to what we were talking about with the no host. I think that the best part of the show was the fact that they didn't have a host and they let Maya Rudolph and Amy Poehler and Tina Fey, I forgot the third one's name for a second there, which is funny because she's the most famous of the three. But I liked it that they gave funny people like 30 seconds to a minute to do something funny. Like I thought Trevor Noah thing was really good, and even though I didn't particularly like it or get the joke, the Melissa McCarthy thing was, I know, a lot of people's favorite moment as well. So I think that was the evidence that the Academy should use to not ever have a host again. Just get 10 funny people and give them a minute in between awards to do something funny, instead of doing the pizza gag or taking them to a theater across the street or that bullshit that never works. Give funny people a chance to do one funny bit, to do their best funny thing that they can think of, and that be the show. Because those work, I think, more times than not. And I think that proved, this past show, that proved that.
I definitely agree.
All right, so that's episode 230 of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast. As always, we hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, subscribe, rate, review us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, basically any good podcatcher you use, we're on it. I actually just added us on SoundCloud, which I should have been doing a long time ago. So if you watch or listen to podcasts on SoundCloud, definitely check us out there as well. You can also check out all of our content on our website, thenerdspodcast.com. Comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Nerds Podcast. Well, I'm sorry, it's youtube.com/thenerdspodcast. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram. They're both at The Nerds Podcast. Like us on Facebook. You can also email us at the nerds you're looking for at gmail.com. And then finally, vote for us for Podcasts a Month at podcastland.com. For Patrick Kuhn,
Tyler Hunt.
We are the nerds you're looking for. Take it easy, nerds.
Later, guys.